Well, good morning, everybody. Let's see. Good morning, everybody. My name is Randy Welsh, and I'm the Executive Director for the National Wilderness Stewardship Alliance, coming to you from the Big Island of Hawaii today. We're finishing up a family trip and looking forward to the webinar that we have scheduled here for you today. I would note that NWSA is the source for information and support for wilderness stewardship volunteer organizations around the country. And we're here today with Dave Cantrell, who is our programs chair who is bringing these webinars to us, organizing them and planning them. And Katie Currier, one of our board members from NWSA, who is leading the panel today about how to attract and recruit volunteers. We'll go ahead. Oops, looks like we just lost Katie. We'll give her a second to come on back. Okay, she is here, but her video cut out for a second. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the webinar over to Katie here in just a second. I want to let everybody know on the webinar that we will go through the presentation to begin with, and then we will respond to questions at the end of the presentation. What I would ask is that you use the question dialog box to ask your questions. We'll queue those up at the end of the presentation, and then we'll have plenty of time for people to respond to those questions. If you do have a particular question for a particular person, go ahead and put that into your question request as well. I think with no further ado, we will go ahead and introduce Katie and her panel. So Katie, as I mentioned, is a board member for the National Wilderness Stewardship Alliance. She's operations officer for the Southern Appalachian Wilderness Stewards, located in Asheville, North Carolina. And Katie, go ahead and take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, Randy. Well, welcome, everyone. We're glad that you're able to join us for this webinar today. We have a great set of panelists here to help us guide us through. Am I still there? Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, something popped up on my screen saying that I wasn't a part of it anymore. So glad to have everyone here. This is a webinar that's focused on both the challenges and strategies surrounding volunteer recruitment that we face as stewardship organizations, whether that is a volunteer or a professional stewardship organization. And so we have three panelists here today. We have Kelly Flowers, and Kelly is the marketing and communications manager for Volunteers for Outdoor Colorado. Volunteers for Outdoor Colorado is a 5-year-old nonprofit dedicated to motivating and enabling people to become active stewards of Colorado's natural resources. And Kelly joined VOC in 2017 after working with a marketing agency and is in charge of engaging existing and potential volunteers through VOC's website, social media, print materials, and more. And then we have Gordon. And Ken has worked as a permanent forest technician on the Green Mountain National Forest in Vermont in wilderness, trails, and recreation since the year 2000. He has hired over a dozen wilderness rangers, either as volunteers, Forest Service seasonals, or Student Conservation Association resource assistants in the past. As a wilderness and trail volunteer supervisor, he has been putting together work projects, arranging schedules, and signing out equipment and supplies for many summer and fall seasons. And most of the volunteers he has worked with in wilderness and trails capacities are retired or college interns. And several times, Ken has had the pleasure of working with the Sierra Club, completing numerous wilderness and trail projects as a group for a week at a time. And over the past couple of years, he has been hiring campground hosts through volunteer.gov as well. And then we have Olivia Acosta, and she has been working as a National Service Coordinator intern with the Appalachian Trail Conservancy for the past 2 years. And she has recently been appointed to ACC's Stewardship Council, prior to which she had been serving as a Next Generation Advisory Council member since 2016. Olivia was born and raised in the city of Yonkers, New York, and is now finishing her bachelor's in Parks and Forest Resource Management with a minor in psychology at Unity College in Maine. So thank you to all our panelists that have joined us today. And why don't we get started with the first question? And somehow it disappeared off my screen. So if you'll give me 1 second. Great. So Olivia, if you'll start, what type of organization do you work for, and how does your organization use volunteers?
So the Appalachian Trail Conservancy works with the National Park Service and 31 various trail maintaining clubs from Georgia to Maine. So you can imagine the Appalachian Trail crosses through 14 states and has a lot of various land managers. But those the volunteers in charge of maintaining the trail for sustainable tread and clearing of blowdowns and a whole host of other activities is essentially relied upon what we call the soul of the Appalachian Trail, which is the cohorts of individuals who are members of the 31 entities that we call trail maintaining clubs. And like I said, these volunteers do a variety of activities from maintaining the trail to corridor stewardship to leadership activities. So the Appalachian Trail and National Park Service works to support those volunteer groups.
Great. And Ken, how about you?
I work for a land management agency called the Forest Service, and just some quick statistics. Green Mountain National Forest is about 400,000 acres in central and southern Vermont, and we recruited a larger number of volunteers on the forest, not all wilderness trails and recreation, but also for helping with fish shocking and campground hosts and wildlife surveys. Statistically, we had 430 volunteers last year at about 16,621 hours. And I guess also 292 were males, 177 females, and 25 people with disabilities, and 37 people with veteran designation. So there's a wide variety of volunteers that have been hired in the last year. So I can provide some examples of volunteer recruitment I've been involved with the Forest Service. First would be with wilderness data collection. I have a couple who go out and collect register sheets once a month, replace the sheets in the box, and we use them to, I don't know, we monitor visitor use and observe group sizes, and we get feedback on the trail conditions that can be useful for management. Additionally, their volunteer work is on their schedule once a month, and they're a great help for search and rescue folks. If somebody signs in at a trailhead, then the search and rescue folks often can find them faster and can save a life. So that's one thing that's going on with volunteers. Another one is that we have 8 wilderness areas here on the Green Mountain National Forest, and that's about 25% of the forest, and the Appalachian Trail and Long Trail going through it. So we have sometimes seasonal wilderness rangers, sometimes volunteers, depending on the year, and student conservation folks working on wilderness and trails. So sometimes it's a mix, and that usually works out fine. Wilderness Ranger volunteers for internships is a great deal. You can work with the intern and their advisor, and you can do the program of work and they can help you get things set up for their work, and you can plan things out on a schedule better usually. So a good experience with that, especially local colleges where they don't need to travel far. Sometimes housing can be a limitation. Other volunteers I've worked with are ones that are retired. I had somebody that was retired from the Air Force that loved to come in and work in the wilderness, and the way he liked to work was to have lists of trail and wilderness work where he could come and pick and choose what he wanted to do when he could come in, and he'd check things off the list, and then he'd add to the list too. So that worked out pretty good. That's a good thing. You get a flexible schedule. And for developed recreation, working with volunteers a little different. I have you probably heard of this, www.volunteer.gov. You get campground hosts submitting applications, and from there you can contact them and do a reference check, see how they're doing for their interest and availability. We don't have that with other volunteer opportunities, but that's how that works. And then partnerships are huge. The Green Mountain Club, the Catamount Trail Association, Addison County Counseling Service, local school groups, they help with our trails and wilderness as volunteers. And having them help manage that is really helpful because it's a large job. So that's all I have for now.
Great. Thanks, Ken.
Thank you.
Kelly, how about you?
Sure. So with Volunteers for Outdoor Colorado, we work in Colorado, all throughout the state on public lands, from the federal lands, working with the U.S. Forest Service and the BLM, as well as to Colorado state parks and local city and county owned open spaces. And volunteer projects is essentially what we do. We engage volunteers on a project by project basis. So we host up to 100 volunteer projects each year, and those can be a simple half-day planting project to overnight camping trips, some of which are as long as 5 days. So there's really a wide variety of projects, both in where they are, what type of work volunteers are doing, and how long they'll be out there and how difficult that work is. So we engage a lot of volunteers from the Denver metro area. We're lucky to see a wide range of people in terms of age volunteer with us. Some of our projects are open to kids as young as 6, so we do get families out. And then we also have a lot of retirees that are some of our most active volunteers, kind of coming out time and time again. But really, there is no long-term commitment for people to volunteer with us. You can just sign up for one project or many. So we definitely want people to come back, but so that retaining volunteers is definitely a challenge and an opportunity that we have. But yeah, so our volunteers also build and maintain trails in terms of actual work. The majority of our projects are around trails, but we also do invasive weed removal, fire and flood mitigation, any form of ecological restoration, really anything that the land managers are looking for to help keep the public lands in working order so we can continue to recreate sustainably.
Wonderful. So the next question is, what are the challenges you encounter or your organization encounters with volunteer recruitment? And what are some methods that you use to address these challenges? Olivia, do you want to start?
So along the Appalachian Trail, one of the biggest challenges we faced was kind of like an identity issue, as in the average person could through hike the entire trail and not comprehend that 31 separate organizations are actually the people who are hosting the volunteer events. So the Appalachian Trail Conservancy thought about it and came up with the solution of creating a clearinghouse for any person who is on our website to see events that are happening with a state location and a city location. And we worked on recruiting this information from the clubs and putting them onto our website. And that was a tool that we used to help support the clubs by finding ways to give them access to effective volunteer event promotion.
Great. And Ken, how about you?
Well, some of the challenges is that a lot of training and supplies and support to be safe and effective is needed with volunteers, and just like anybody, and especially the folks that are working on the forest and the trails and wilderness and recreation. They're out in the front lines with the public, so I want to make sure they have good confidence and they know what they're doing and that they don't get hurt. So it's important to take that time, help them. So having a solid program of work is important, so you know what you can talk about with a volunteer and find out what their interests are. Also try to match it with your program needs, so there's some common ground covered, and they might just be volunteering to just get outside, or they might be trying to get experience for future jobs, so knowing what their personal goals are can help you cater things to what they need and then help them out. And, it's good for, I don't know, just the long-term feeling of accomplishment. With an agreement, if you want to get past some of the challenges of trying to get information to volunteers, I've sent PowerPoints or reading materials to help them find out what they might be interested in exploring more. Also, getting supplies for them. It's good to send them a list or let them talk with them about what you have for supplies, and then see what they want to use of their own and what you'll need to purchase before they come on. That helps too. We feel they're all set to go.
Great. Kelly, how about you?
Sure. So one of the challenges we have with recruitment is the majority of our staff is based in Denver, but our projects are throughout the state. And so the challenge we face is trying to recruit local volunteers in communities where we might not have a presence or as much knowledge about. And we encounter that this season with a project that was in a very rural part of the state, closer to New Mexico than it was to Denver. And so there were really two kind of big takeaways that we got from that. And the first was to not be afraid to ask for help and leverage your partnerships. And so we reached out to a lot of our partners that were closer to that community and really did our research with them to figure out, you know, who lives in these communities, how do they get their news, what barriers might they have to volunteering, to really get a better understanding of that community, and then based our outreach and volunteer recruitment around what we learned. So in this rural area, we learned that they don't use the internet as much. Some people simply don't have it, but everybody gets the local newspaper. And so instead of, you know, normally we would do a lot of recruitment through social media and things like that. And so for this project, instead of focusing on those typical channels, we reached out to local newspapers. We actually mailed flyers to local businesses, and really saw a lot of return on that in terms of engaging the local community. So I think in terms of strategies, in addition to leveraging those partners and those connections, it's really about tailoring your outreach to who you're trying to reach, because families will get their information from a different place than seniors and a different place from millennials. And so really understanding who it is that you're trying to reach and adjusting accordingly is one of our big strategies.
Great. And I think, you know, this is an area where my organization, Southern Appalachian Wilderness Stewards, we run into challenges when it comes to having a large footprint for recruitment. And, you know, like Kelly talked about, we found that partnering with those local organizations and finding those local community members that can kind of be the connection and representative for our organization and that local contact for the volunteers is really helpful and, absolutely necessary to be able to reach, beyond or reach into a larger landscape if that's the type of organization that you run. So great, thanks, Kelly. The next question is, what are some success stories of volunteer recruitment from your organization? And Olivia, did you want to start, and do you need to share your screen? Oh, you're on mute.
Yes, if sharing capabilities is possible, that would be great.
All right, you should have that. Yep, there you go.
All right. So from posting our events on the Appalachian Trail Conservancy's website, a lot of the first year that we did this was last year, and we struggled a lot with recruiting information from our clubs. It was kind of like pulling teeth. It was hard to show them that what we were trying to do was going to be beneficial and not a burden, because these are volunteers that already have a task at hand. So for them to be recruiting volunteers on top of what they're already doing was a big ask. So our first year was rather challenging. Our second year comes along and clubs are actually coming to us, asking us if we can post their events, which is a huge win for us, because that means we're increasing the net that we're throwing out there when we're trying to get AT volunteer stewards. And these graphs here, they differ a little bit with ranges because of the way that we report to our federal partners. But as you can tell, the darker blue and the red and the yellow are our younger age groups on both charts. And our second year around, we're seeing an increase in younger individuals who are signing up and registering for these events, which is big. And on top of that, we're also collecting other various data when volunteers are applying for these to join, and clubs are getting back to us saying that these volunteers are working well and that they hope they come back. And we're able to collect this information and analyze it and bring it back to our clubs and show them the benefits. And from that, we've been creating tools. So last month, I hosted an effective how to promote volunteer events effectively in a webinar. And there we give the clubs access to ways that they can also take what we've learned and put it into their own practice. So here we have kind of like a checklist of things that a prospective volunteer looking at a website might be interested or would need to know. And we found out that the most important aspect you can have when you're posting an event online is to describe your event in detail and provide a really good why. So if you're building a turnpike, not everybody knows what a turnpike is. There's different terms throughout the country for what that is too. So just explaining that you're creating a sustainable dry surface that all visitors are going to enjoy really entices people to become a part of what you're trying to do, which is great. And that's all I have.
Great, thanks. Ken, how about you?
Well, success is always measured if somebody comes back as a volunteer the next season. That's always a great thing. Like mentioned before, I did have some success with the Sierra Club. They have a national outdoor leadership trip group that came to the forest, and they also had a national outing club group come, and for a week at a time, they come as a force that can really help you with the backlog of work that you can't get to for operations and maintenance that requires a crew. This particular crew that came to the forest helped us remove about 650 feet of steel pipe from the Bristol Cliffs wilderness with pack boards and carrying out of the wilderness, and we got it to a transfer station, and also 250 feet of plastic pipe. This is from an old well that was in the wilderness before designation and left there. So we helped clean that up. That was a great project. Would have taken one person several weeks to do that, and it'd been a long trip for them, back and forth a lot. They had a lot of fun with it. They also were able to remove a bridge that was in disrepair from a wilderness trail that wasn't needed, and post some boundary signs, and they also were able to get some signs up for a restricted use area where we had some illegal cutting. They did a variety of work that we just couldn't get to, and we got a big push from them. Like, you can set them up in a campground for a week with reserving a spot for them, and help them with logistics, and they have their own leaders that can help also, and some tools. Great group to work with.
Great. And Kelly, how about you?
So one of our successes, last year we hosted a women's only volunteer project, and that came to fruition because we had gotten some feedback from female volunteers that when they were out on projects, a lot of times the men weren't letting them do things like lift heavy rocks and things like that, which was really discouraging and also kind of intimidating, especially to first-time volunteers. And so last year we put together this project and really weren't sure how it was going to go, but we were able to get 75 women to sign up without much difficulty. It was a very popular choice. And then when we actually were on that project, we got a lot of feedback from those volunteers. A lot of them were first-time volunteers who told us that they wouldn't have signed up if it hadn't been that type of opportunity. It was also our most ethnically diverse project that year. And we've seen many of those women come back to our general volunteer projects now that they've kind of had that entry point to build their confidence and also kind of build community, make friends within the VOC ranks. Of course, we also talked to, the volunteers that we knew were discouraging people to avoid that problem in the future, but that project was so successful that we had another one this year and plan to have them in the future. And so that was something that we definitely consider a success in terms of making, again, that kind of entry point to get people involved who might have not wanted to get involved otherwise.
Great. And so, I'm going to continue to chime in with Southern Appalachian Wilderness Stewards as well. Similarly, we have started running women's work days with the Appalachian Trail Conservancy in partnership. And so we're joining forces to recruit women from across our landscape. And we've been hosting these volunteer days in a variety of different locations to try and provide that opportunity to different communities, and working with some of the local Appalachian Trail maintaining clubs as well, so that we have that local tie. We also work closely with different colleges and universities, and we've been able to build some really great partnerships with those colleges and universities, where those volunteers may not be volunteers that return on a monthly or yearly basis, but the overall organization that we are working with is a partner who brings volunteers to the table, and we're able to reach more students and educate them about wilderness, about Leave No Trace, and just get them the opportunity to explore this new landscape as they are setting off on their college career. And so, at least for SAWS being in a larger landscape, we have recognized that we really need to work with different partners to engage volunteers versus trying to find those individual volunteers, because we don't have the capacity across our landscape to volunteer projects on a regular basis for those volunteers. So yeah, great. So now first off, is there anything else that panelists would like to share before we turn this over to questions? Great. Okay. So if anybody has questions in the audience, feel free to put those in the chat box, and panelists will be happy to answer those questions for you.
Actually, please use the question dialog box, not the chat function. That's okay. Yeah, we're thankful for our panelists to come and share some of the insights they have with their volunteer recruitment. And we know we're going to have some questions, so please go ahead and start asking those questions. Oh, here they're already starting to come in. Okay, so the first question we have is, how do you engage minority groups? What strategies, techniques have you been using to get underserved populations, minorities to attend volunteer programs?
I can try
Okay,
and
I'll let you
stab
take
at
it.
that one. So as Katie had mentioned, SAWS is working with the Appalachian Trail Conservancy for Women's Work Days. So the Women's Work Days are in association with affinity groups that ATC has volunteer leaders organizing. So some of our volunteer groups that are affinity groups include veterans, African Americans, Latinx, and women. So those are some ways that we're enabling people to feel comfortable going into an environment that they might not necessarily be accustomed to, as if they're surrounded by like-minded, like-identity individuals.
Okay.
Kelly, do you have any thoughts on
Yeah, I can add a little bit to it. It's definitely something that we're trying to do more and more of. A lot of our volunteers are white older men, which is great, but we'd like to have our volunteer ranks reflect Colorado a little bit more. And so most of the work that we've done with minority populations, a lot of that is through the local schools. I'm pretty sure Denver Public Schools is one of the most diverse school systems, either in the state or maybe even the country. And so we've done a lot of work in kind of lower income communities, and with those projects, we're actually working oftentimes in that community on, a local park, planting trees in that area. And so we've had a lot of success there. And then in terms of our broader volunteer projects, this is something that we're really looking closely at as we kind of plan out our priorities over the next few years. And I think partners are really going to come into play there. We know that we're not as entrenched in some of those communities as we could be. And so figuring out what partners we can talk to and connections we can build to really understand those communities better and how to maybe involve them.
Okay, so our next respondent has asked a series of questions. So let's just break this down into a couple of different responses. So the first question would be, do you have any assessment of the types and skills of volunteers that you use? So are there any particular types of assessments you do in your local communities about volunteers to try to generate that potential workforce?
I can kind of start with that. So we do that in a few ways. When it comes to technical and leadership skills, we do have our own training program, and so we do keep track of that in our volunteer database. But in addition, when you sign up for our newsletter, for example, or fill out a volunteer form, there's a section on there that marks what interests you have and what skills. And so that's a really good way for us to keep track of what people are interested in. So that way, when those opportunities come up, we can just pull that list right away and be like, okay, these people really want to work on high alpine projects, and we can reach out to those people accordingly. And that was actually something I meant to mention on the last one too, is one of the things that we're going to start doing is also tracking, what languages do people speak, so that if we're engaging Spanish speaking communities, we can bring in volunteers accordingly who match that need.
Any of the other panelists do any sort of assessments for the type of skills of volunteers that you're using?
Well, there's a basic volunteer application that, gives an opportunity to show their initial interest to start the conversation, but usually one-on-one with the volunteer agreement.
Great. Yeah, and Southern Appalachian Wilderness Stewards, we have a limited hurdles for volunteers to go through, but depending on the technicality of the project, we at times, if they're using crosscut saws, they may need to have a certification to be out there unless they're working with somebody who is certified. And so we are checking folks' certifications, and really trying to communicate that. And it also gives those more advanced volunteers opportunities to use a variety of skills. And we also provide opportunities for training for those volunteers.
I'm not sure. You cut out that last little bit there, Katie. So along those lines, a couple of people have touched on it. What do each of your organizations do to evaluate the satisfaction of your volunteers and your staff? We had Rebecca Nemec from Colorado State University do a research study that looked at ways that people were satisfied and what led to retention of volunteers. But and that information is available on our website, by the way, but how do each of your groups evaluate satisfaction of volunteers and staff?
Sure, I can start. So for each of our projects, after each project, we do send out a link to an online survey. It's pretty short, about 10 questions, and we look at that survey year over year to see if any changes need to be made. And we track those responses throughout the season as well, and look at how feedback's going, see if there's anything we need to adjust. So that's a huge measurement, is just that post-project survey. And then we have another survey that goes out 3 times a season, which is about kind of more the broader volunteer experience as a whole. So compared to just how was this specific project, was there enough food, etc. It's more about, how did the volunteer experience shape your understanding of conservation needs in the state or whatever that might be. So we rely a lot on those online surveys, and that's probably the most quantitative data that we have. Otherwise, listen to what people tell us. Our volunteers are usually happy to give us feedback if we ask for it, or even if we don't.
Any of the other panelists?
I think just checking in with somebody weekly or more, having good communications is important, and that's having someone designated as someone's go-to person and being available is really important.
Katie or Olivia, do you have other ways of evaluating satisfaction of volunteers?
I would say that ATC leans on forums that Volunteer Outdoor Colorado offers, because it's effective in finding out how we can better support our clubs and what they do with their volunteers, and also having a list of volunteers who are potentially interested for future events. So not only are you trying to improve the work that you and your organizations are doing, but you're also stacking up on future volunteers to remain involved.
Katie, did you have anything to add?
I don't. SAWS actually is not very good at this point at surveying our volunteers to get feedback. And, I think part of that is because we partner with so many other organizations to bring volunteers in, and we are kind of the wilderness experts that go out and have the skill set to lead the volunteer days. But then we have pretty often our volunteers are one-time volunteers. So that's something we need to work on.
Well, one thing I know that you do very well is training of volunteers. So why don't you start off talking about what kind of training opportunities you offer to volunteers, and why these are so effective in getting people to participate, and then each of the other panels in turn.
Yeah, absolutely. So SAWS works in partnership with the Forest Service and the Appalachian Trail Conservancy to hold a yearly training called the Wilderness Skills Institute, and it's 2 weeks in May. That there's a variety of courses that are offered, usually about 3 or 4 courses per week, and those trainings are free to volunteers, to Forest Service employees, to partner organization employees, but they include trainings, both hard skills and then, maybe more wilderness focused, wilderness monitoring, that sort of stuff. So we offer crosscut saw training, as well as wilderness first aid. And we offer rock work training. We offer trails training, both basic and more advanced. We've held Leave No Trace courses, Master Educator courses, crosscut saw sharpening, kind of a wide variety. And in some ways, we use it as a training opportunity for our employees that are going to be seasonal employees, but we open it up as the Forest Service, SAWS, and ATC to reach our volunteers and provide them with some training opportunities that will keep them coming back and broaden their skill set. We also hold a similar training out in Arkansas called Great Rivers Wilderness Skills Institute, and we're just in the 2nd year of that, and that's a partnership between SAWS and the Forest Service to help train wilderness enthusiasts out in the Midwest. And then we have more weekend trainings available, and I teach about 10 to 12 crosscut courses every year where I certify volunteers. We're a cooperator with the U.S. Forest Service, and so we have the authority to certify volunteers, Forest Service employees, and our own employees as crosscut sawyers.
Katie, before we move on to the other panelists to talk about their training opportunities, could you just speak to the effectiveness and the value of having volunteers and agency employees go through the same training together?
Absolutely. So every course, every crosscut course that I teach, and then, the Skills Institute, especially having those partners as well as the agencies working side by side and learning side by side builds that level of trust and skill, creates or helps us to understand that we're all entering this work with similar skill sets and background knowledge. And it's really allowed us, especially with WSI, and we've had year after year of volunteers returning, building those relationships between agencies and volunteers and these partner organizations. And in the Southeast, the Forest Service Region 8 is so proud of being known as, the region that has some of the strongest partnerships in the country. That's what they'll say. It may be different. Other regions may think that they have strong partnerships too, but at this point, that's where we're headed with wilderness stewardship. And so to provide those opportunities of learning and to have volunteers teaching Forest Service employees and Forest Service employees teaching volunteers kind of breaks down those barriers.
Other panelists, you want to talk to the training opportunities that you provide?
Well, our training opportunities sound really similar to Katie's in terms of, who they're for and what kind of skills they teach. So I won't get too much into that, but one thing in terms of how we get volunteers into those trainings is, unfortunately, they're not free for our volunteers, but we often offer discounts because you can take the trainings either as another organization or you can take it as somebody who wants to volunteer for VOC. And so we try to offer discounts where we can for folks who want to use this training to help VOC. And we host a event each January or early February to kind of capitalize on people's excitement around the new year and New Year's. And at that event is where we can really talk to volunteers one-on-one, tell them a little bit more about trainings, what they can do with those trainings. And then for folks who attend that event, they usually get a much steeper discount if they sign up for a training, within a week of that event. And so that's been a really good way for us to get new people into our trained volunteer ranks and get them in early.
Yeah, I think what Region 8 and SAW is doing is awesome. It's great to front load the leave no trace training, the SAW training, the first aid, get it all done early and establish friends and communications, and that way volunteer can feel flexible and confident in going out and doing the work. It's a great atmosphere, and what you can provide for training in the beginning will be valuable time where you won't have to fix mistakes or have incidents in the future. So it's really important to do that. And, we try to do that here, but we're not at the level of putting on large trainings. It's more if we can find a partnership doing first aid, getting in on that, or supplying crosscut saw training and having a mix of volunteers and Forest Service and doctors, whatever we can do. But that's a great strategy.
Olivia, do you have anything to add?
I would just second what Katie said about having a yearly gathering that Appalachian Trail Conservancy offers a volunteer leadership meeting for clubs to send 2 members from their region. And personally, I think we could do a better job of supporting volunteer training in those clubs rather than just supporting the leaders of those clubs, because information doesn't necessarily dissipate to all sectors of the club. So last year's volunteer leadership meeting, we focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that work is important because it takes the whole club to join in. So the dissipation of information is something that we could definitely work on. But we also have thousands of volunteers, so big task.
Okay. Our next question is one that could be looked at from 2 different perspectives. So the first part of this is, as you're doing recruitment, what kind of tips do you have for creating successful mixed age projects that include both young and old and everything in between? And then vice versa of that is, do you have strategies for focusing on specific age groups, and what might those be? So kind of a 2-part question, answered either way, any which way you feel appropriate.
I can start with that and say that I think for our volunteers on the Appalachian Trail, there's 2 questions you can ask yourself when you're planning an event, and it's, what are you trying to do? Are you trying to accomplish a task, or is your task to recruit new volunteers? But either way, when you're planning your event, trying to find details that you might not necessarily consider as a volunteer task. So maybe someone's interested in bringing food for lunch. That's a great way. People love free food. And you're also giving a volunteer an opportunity to participate in something they might not be able to participate in. And currently we're working on creating a description for a work trip liaison. So this liaison's job is to they can participate in the work event, but their main goal is to, interpret what had happened during that work trip to the broader community as a way to increase interest in local constituents.
I think a lot of what we have for our age groups is kind of depends on some of the partnerships we're in, like the Addison County Counseling Services, high school age kids that go out and clear trails, and we can do a presentation on a topic like moose or visitor use or wilderness. They'll have some learning opportunities. So it's like the Green Mountain Club puts on an excellent program that includes lots of different groups throughout their membership in the state. But as far as like setting it up individually and having age groups, it's retirees and internships. It's kind of could be any age at this point.
Yeah, and we don't have too many age-specific projects. The one thing that does come to mind is we have some family camping projects. And for those, we're able to partner with a youth environmental education organization, so somebody whose sweet spot is really dealing with children. And then the adults and teenagers are able to work on the trail or whatever the project may be. And then while they're doing that, the kids that are 6 to 11 are with that youth organization somewhere else nearby doing more age appropriate activities. And then everybody at the end of the day is able to come back together for dinner and camping. So that's one way that we have a more specific age tailoring when it comes to the project itself. Otherwise, it's usually just whoever wants to come based on what minimum age is appropriate for the task at hand.
Yeah, and I think one thing that we've started to be more aware of is trying to select a variety of different days throughout the week to offer volunteer opportunities. Living in Asheville, North Carolina, it's actually a pretty service industry heavy economy. And so, we've found success hosting volunteer days on a Wednesday and then also having them on Saturdays to reach different individuals in the community. And so, I would also consider potentially maybe not a volunteer opportunity, but hosting, maybe a wilderness talk or leave no trace training in the evening, just to try and find ways to reach, both younger folks, older folks, parents that maybe their only time is on the weekend. So having that flexibility. And then, one of our strategies is to partner with local colleges, like I mentioned, and that definitely brings in a younger group. I think it's been shown that millennials are some of the folks, and I'm a millennial, so I feel like I can say this, but that we are some of the least likely to volunteer. And so if we can find ways to access those individuals through organizations that they're already a part of, whether it's their work or church or college or university, that may be the best strategy.
So the question that we educational programs into the volunteer activities about current forest projects or decisions that are ongoing, either as a way to get buy-in on those decisions or to provide clarification or additional information about what might be happening currently on your local forest unit. Any of you?
rebuttal.
I kind of missed the first half, yeah, but I think you're getting to the point of like education in combination with stewardship. Is that?
The question had to do with trying to what kind of buy-in volunteers have with the types of activities, programs, decisions that are going on the forest. And I was just wondering if you incorporate any education efforts about those sort of decisions that might be ongoing on your local units into volunteer programs. Not that we tried to sway people's opinion, but it's going to come up if there is something controversial happening on your unit. And how might you address those sort of issues in the volunteer activities that you put on?
Yeah, so at SAWS, especially if we are volunteer opportunities in partnership with another organization, we give each organization the opportunity to share what their organization does. And then we'll also, as a wilderness stewardship organization, take a chunk of the day for wilderness specific education for the volunteers. So it may not be specifically addressing an individual issue on, the district or in the wilderness area, but we at least try to start to have that conversation about what is wilderness, and if folks are familiar with any of those issues, that's an opportunity for them to bring them up, and we can have a broader conversation about it.
Okay. Our time is growing short, so a couple other quick questions. What sort of non-monetary volunteer gifts have you seen that are most appreciated by your volunteers? So what kind of gifts do you give, and what do you think people appreciate the most? Just real quickly. Katie?
I would say meals after volunteer days, just to bring that community together and sum up the day.
Kelly?
Yeah, I would definitely second food and beer if you can get it. And then otherwise just other opportunities for community building and for hanging out with each other.
Okay. How about you, Cam?
If somebody volunteers over 250 hours, they can get a pass into the parks and forests. That's a good perk for them. We gave that out before.
Yeah. Olivia?
So offering swag items such as water bottles and jackets and pins are great ways.
Okay. There was a question about, does the Forest Service require certification for crosscut saws? And yes, they do. And they have the capability of being trained either locally through an organization that has a certified trainer, or by a Forest Service certification course. And I think the last question, I think I hear my phone is going through some issues, but I think the last question that we have time for today, how do you handle, what kind of follow-up do you do with people who are registered for a volunteer event but then fail to show up? Or what kind of efforts do you take to remind people about their volunteer effort that they've signed up for, and how do you follow up with them if they don't show up?
We had that problem, and I mean, we still have that problem, but we were able to mitigate just the number of no-shows and really late cancellations by changing some of our messaging that went out. So before you even sign up for a project, on the description, it very clearly says, we're relying on you to be here. This is why it's so important to have these specific volunteer numbers. And then, so people know from the very get-go that if you sign up, it is a commitment and we expect you to be there. And then we have a pre-project email a month out, as well as 2 weeks out before the project. And one of the first things you see in emails is how to cancel and a reminder about why it's important that we know if you're coming or not. And that has helped reduce the number of no-shows. And if people are canceling, we know well in advance so we can fill that spot. In terms of no-shows themselves, I don't think we actually do follow up with them after that fact, but I think that's a good thing to look into to find out why and how to prevent it.
Okay. Anybody else like to add other thoughts?
Well, working out a schedule ahead of time helps, but sometimes you don't have a no-show. You just have to communicate with them and find out what's going on.
Okay. So we've got a couple more questions here if you can try to respond to quickly, because then we're running out of time. But any helpful tips for putting on volunteer appreciation recognition events? And then how far out in advance do you plan your volunteer activities to be successful in recruiting people? So if you could just take those two questions and then we'll wrap it up from there.
I'd say it's always nice to have like an annual award that, you know, maybe recognizes one specific volunteer, just to kind of potentially give people something to strive for, with like a nice little gift or recognition.
And I'll say for events, it's nice to involve the volunteers as much as possible. So presenting awards, maybe see if there's another volunteer who knows them well that presents that award to them instead of a staff member.
Yeah, something from the gift shop. Enfia, Smokey the Bear type stuff works well for individuals, and so I do that sometimes.
Something that we work on is writing articles every month about specific volunteers, which not only appreciates them, but it shows the broad range of volunteer activities that are happening and the diverse individuals that actually volunteer along the trail.
Okay. Well, I'm going to just stop it here because we've used up our hour. I want to thank all of our panelists for coming and sharing their information with our audience. We want to thank the audience for sticking with us and listening and being very active with the questions today. We certainly appreciate that. We hope that we've been able to address most, if not all of them. I would remind you that our NWSA webinar series will continue on into 2020. We're developing a full, robust lineup the second Tuesday of every month at 1 o'clock Mountain Time. In January, our first webinar up will be talking about the WildSpotter app and its use for identifying invasive species, doing surveys that can be entered into a national database. And we'll have people from the University of Georgia that will help explain that application and what it can do for your organization as a way of keeping track of invasive species infestations and in planning future treatments. So again, thank you again to all of our panelists today. Dave, any final words from you before we close out?
Interesting and helpful, guys. Thank you so much for being here and sharing your ideas.
All right, thanks to our audience for coming and participating. This webinar has been recorded and will be posted on the NWSA website shortly, within a week or so. And I want to thank everybody for attending today and hope that you have a great week. Enjoy Christmas as the seasons start to come forward. So thanks, everybody. We are now closed. As soon as I can find the end button.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you now.
Thank you.
Looks like pretty much everybody is going to can.
Yeah. Have a good
All
night.
right, we're done.
Bye-bye.
Okay.